security to the forefront this time last year. Don't forget, people were facing rationing of salads due to weather events in Morocco. We've seen extraordinary events over the last few years, and I hope this government, and indeed all parties, this is the start of a new chapter of taking food security seriously.
Barclays Bank has announced a drop in profits. They fell last year by 6% to £6.6 billion. Here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
Barclays is different from other high street banks such as NatWest and Lloyds. It has a bigger investment banking division which has suffered as the flow of big deals got hit by higher interest rates. The nearly £1 billion cost of laying off 5,000 roles and moving from one of its Canary Wharf offices also hit profits. Barclays recently bought out Tesco's banking business and will seek to grow its wealth management division while shrinking its investment bank as a proportion of its activities. This marked a big departure from the strategy of its former chief executive, American Jes Staley. He was dismissed by the board when they found he'd misled them over the nature of his relationship with the disgraced financier, Jeffrey Epstein, who died in custody having been jailed for sex trafficking offences.
A website run by a criminal gang which organises cyber attacks appears to have been taken over by law enforcement agencies. A message has appeared on the site belonging to the gang called Lockbit. More details from our security correspondent, Gordon Carrell.
Lockbit is a prolific cyber criminal group which sells tools to carry out so-called ransomware attacks, in which computer networks are infiltrated and data is held until a ransom is paid. But Lockbit's own website appears to have been compromised by law enforcement. The front page now contains the emblems of multiple law enforcement agencies and a message reading, "The site is under the control of the National Crime Agency of the UK, working in close cooperation with the FBI and the International Law Enforcement Task Force Operation Kronos."
Our security correspondent, Gordon Carrell.
Thank you, Tom. It's coming up to 8:10. The man who was the chairman of the post office until just a few weeks ago has repeated his claim that he was told to slow down compensation to hundreds of postmasters and postmistresses. Last night, Henry Staunton issued a statement saying that he was so amazed by the request from the government official on the post office board, he wrote down what he'd been told, and a record of it must still be in post office files. He was repeating his allegations after explosive claims made in the House of Commons by the business secretary, Kemi Badenoch, that Staunton was spreading falsehoods, as she claimed he was sacked whilst being under investigation for bullying, something he says he knew nothing about.
It is not fair on the victims of this scandal, which has already ruined so many lives and livelihoods, to claim, as Mr. Staunton has done, that this is being dragged out a second longer than it ought to be. For Henry Staunton to suggest otherwise, for whatever personal motives, is a disgrace.
We would, of course, like to hear from Mr. Staunton directly. He is waiting to give evidence to a Commons inquiry. We'll hear from the chair of that inquiry in just a second. But let us put aside for a second the he said, she said element of this row. What really matters here is the substance. Did the government go slow on paying out compensation in order to, in Staunton's own words, limp to the election without making those payouts? Let's start with our business editor, Simon Jack. It is pretty extraordinary to have a senior business figure clashing with the business secretary in quite this way.
I can't remember anything quite like it, Nick. I mean, these versions of events are so bitterly and radically divergent. You've got Henry Staunton on one side. Now, this is a man who's, a boardroom veteran. He's been on the board of Legal & General, ITN Granada. He's going to be chair of WH Smith. He's in his mid-70s, and he's never courted much controversy that I can remember ever before. And in his letter, he said that he's not in the habit of resorting to fabrication or invention. And you've got this senior business figure and the business secretary are basically accusing each other of lying with some pretty extraordinary language. You heard Kemi Badenoch there saying it was a disgrace. He's saying that her version of events was an astonishing series of claims. And given they're so far apart on what they said actually went on here, it's hard to see, when we get to the bottom of all this, how one of them doesn't end up seriously discredited.
But isn't it the case that on the real essence of this, there isn't yet disagreement? Yes, they argue about how she's acted, why she's acted, what she said on the phone call, whether he was under investigation for bullying and so on and so forth. But on that central claim that he was told by a senior government official, slow down, I think I'm right in saying she simply said she'd not seen evidence to that effect.
Yeah, that's what she said. But then she was pressed on. She said that there was no evidence of that. She couldn't find any evidence of it. He says, of course, he's got a file note. He was surprised by the retirement. That should be in the post office record. But when pressed by the shadow business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, can you categorically say that didn't happen? She said, I can. So the backdrop of this is, the payment of the compensation has been slow. Of the 1 billion that's so far been set aside, about 150 million has been paid out. And we've done stories about people saying the process has become very slow, very bureaucratic, something Henry Staunton himself does admit. But like I say, the idea that he was deliberately told to go slow is something they say there's no evidence of. And interestingly, Billy Badenoch said, there's no incentive for me to do that. Why is there's no political capital in us dragging our feet? The process may be bureaucratic. He's saying we'll leave it to others to decide whether the urgency of paying out to Toastmasters ramped up after the screening of that of the ITV drama about the events there. He's saying that I'm going to leave that for others to decide.
Simon Jack, thank you. Let's turn, before we go to Liam Byrne, the Labour MP who chairs the Business and Trade Committee, to Chris Head, a former sub-postmaster, who was told by the Post Office that he owed them more than £18,000. Morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you make of this round?
It's just extraordinary. I said it's the story that keeps on giving, It's all these revelations that come out. And I said we don't know, obviously, because as this continues with this story, there is a lack of transparency in everything that comes out. I think Jonathan Reynolds mentioned yesterday that we need to see the correspondence between Post Office, the department, and UKGI, because all of this time everything just gets shrouded in a massive I think of secrecy and potential cover-up.
Just translate that phrase UKGI, because effectively it's the jargon used, isn't it, for the top official, not a minister, but who sits on the Post Office board on behalf of the taxpayer, which really and truthfully is on behalf of the Treasury.
Yeah, so UKGI is a government-owned entity which is called UK Governments and Investments, and they are ultimately they have a board, a member that sits on the Post Office board, and they are ultimately in control.
Now you don't need reminding, Chris, that there is a human element to this. Just tell listeners what happened to you. How much were you told that you owed the Post Office?
Yeah, I mean, I had shortfalls over the years, and obviously I know now through this book that I'd actually repaid close to £22,000 in shortfalls over the time, but I was actually suspended and terminated over a final discrepancy of over £88,500.
That's what they said you owed?
Yes.
And there was a danger, presumably, that you could have been sent to prison for that?
Exactly, yeah. It was a criminal investigation for 6 months, 2 interviews under caution. After 6 months they dropped it, but they wouldn't give me a reason why. Then they wrote to me and said we're going to continue with the civil proceedings, and then obviously that only got put on stay for a 5-year period because Alan Bates got the group litigation order granted in 2016. So that hung over my head for another 5 years beyond that.
Yeah, no wonder you want to see justice done. Chris Head, thank you very much for joining us. Listening to that, Liam Byrne, Labour MP, Chair of the Business and Trade Committee. I want to come to a BBC investigation with you in a second, Mr Byrne, about who knew what when. But let us begin, if we could, with this row between the Minister and Mr Staunton. Are you hoping you can get to the bottom of it?
Yes, because what we can do without right now is a war of words between the Secretary of State and the former chairman. What we really need is ministers writing cheques to the hundreds of sub-postmasters who need redress and have been waiting far too long. And sometimes numbers do speak volumes. And if you think about the 2 different groups here, the GLO group of which Mr Bates was part, that was originally 555 people in that group. Only 28 of those people have had full and final settlement from the claims. And then if you look at the number of people who were convicted, people like Joe Hamilton, there were 700 people in that group. Only 33 of those claims have had full and final settlement. So the reason that the allegations about the go slow order is so important is because, frankly, not enough people people are getting redress fast enough. And there's a new bill that's coming to the House of Commons soon, which will overturn lots of convictions. And there's a strong case for writing into that bill a hard deadline for getting all of these claims finally settled. And that's why we need to get the truth of whether there was a go-slow order or not.
Can you and your committee get either from Mr. Staunton or from the Post Office or from the government the evidence that might allow us as the public, and more importantly those who've lost money and lost their freedom in some cases, the evidence as to whether he was told to go slow on compensation?
That is my hope. So the powers given to select committees are quite simple. We have the power to send for people and papers. So yesterday I invited Mr. Staunton to come before the committee next week, and today we will be sending all the papers that we need to try and get to the truth. Crucially, we'll be sending for that file note that Mr. Staunton says that he made that sets out the go-slow order that he says he received from senior civil servants in the department, but which the Secretary of State professed no knowledge of yesterday.
Can you answer the question posed by the Business Secretary, which is, why would we? She effectively was saying, look, £1 billion is a lot to those individuals, but it's not a lot in the government accounts. What possible reason would we to have gone slowly? You're a former Chief Secretary of the Treasury. You would know that £1 billion sounds like an awful lot of money. It's not that much in the national accounts.
Well, it is a lot of money in the scheme of the Department for Business and Trade, which of course is paying the bills here. And so I'm afraid that there is talk in investments here about whether has gone slow in order to put the financial abilities on the election. Very much hope that. Honestly, both things could be true. I mean, it could be true that a senior civil servant said to Mr. Staunton, go slow, and it could also be true that the Secretary of State did not wish that to happen. Sometimes these things do happen in Westminster. The bill that is coming before Parliament is so important because we've got to cut through this nonsense and make sure that those that were wronged get full and final redress. And the cleanest and simplest way to do that is to write onto the face of the laws of the land a hard deadline for settling the claims.
Let's turn finally then to an important story again from our business correspondent Andy Verity. He's been digging through documents after a Freedom of Information request that suggests that the Post Office ditched an investigation into whether Fujitsu could alter the computer programs, could alter what was in a sub-postmaster or mistress's cash accounts, and that ministers were alerted about it some years ago.
So this is a really significant story. I mean, it reveals two things. So it reveals, firstly, there was a behaviour of the Post Office, basically cancelling investigations that might produce a truth which undermined their case in law. And remember that the Post Office is still employing a number of these investigators that were known as the untouchables, so that these people are kind of still around. But crucially, what the story reveals is that ministers were cited on this. There is clear evidence from your FOIs that this information went through ministerial offices. Now, we have got a judge-led inquiry that is getting to the bottom of who knew what and when, but this would appear to be the first evidence that we've got from quite an early stage that ministers were cited on just what it was that was going on.
Liam Burton, Chair of the Business and Trade Committee. Thanks for joining us.
8 is the time. As you would expect in what is almost certainly an election year, this programme is going to be testing voter sentiment in different ways, including return over time to a selection of seats where different factors are at play and where, through a series of reports, we will be able to build a picture of what matters in a particular parliamentary area and why. The constituency I will be following is Motherwell and Wishaw, southeast of Glasgow. Labour held until 2015, SNP since then, which is becoming the larger seat of Motherwell, Wishaw and Carluke under boundary changes that also reduce the number of Scottish seats of Westminster from 59 to 57. And for this first report, I had 2 expert guides. In the heart of Motherwell Town Centre is North Lanarkshire Heritage Centre, which is where I am now. There are archives on site, there's an exhibition space, and up these stairs is a viewing platform, which is where I'll be able to have a look out across the area. And I'm going to meet Ewan Gibbs, who is a lecturer in economic and social history at Glasgow University, and who is going to help me understand what we'll see from the top of the tower. Hello, Ewan. Hello. Luckily it's not raining, we've got a clear view. What's the most important thing to take in as we stand here looking out on Motherwell?
Well, actually, I think we should start with the railway. Motherwell's origins as Steelopolis lie in the fact that rail transport became the economical way to transport coal and steel, and the New Caledonian Railway was laid in 1848. And it's really in the years after that that you see the development firstly of a malleable iron industry, and then in the late 18th century the beginning of open hearth steel manufacturing, which creates an explosion of immigration to the town and economic activity.
The biggest one, the steelworks that people might remember the name of, is Ravenscraig, which was closed in the early 90s. From where we are standing, where was that?
Right ahead of us, essentially, towards Glasgow, away beyond the football stadium.
So what happened in the 90s when Ravenscraig stopped working and then was pulled down?
Ravenscraig is the last remaining large steel production unit in Scotland. Its future is subject to great political contestation. It's a subject of political controversy, and it's not just about jobs in Lanarkshire, it's about the future of Scottish industry and Scotland's economy. So the final closure of Ravenscraig happens after the steel industry is privatised. So in the early 1990s it shuts. There's mass unemployment in Lanarkshire in the 80s and into the early 1990s, and also large numbers of, particularly of men who worked in coal mining and steel making, are effectively withdrawn from the labour market for the payment of incapacity benefits and long-term redundancy pay.
How would you characterise the population of Motherwell today?
One of the changes that's happened is the growth of commuting. Lanarkshire is at the centre of commuting in Scotland because it's between its two largest cities, and that's been encouraged by the availability of new private housing, more affluent and comfortable white-collar workers who might also work in the public sector within Lanarkshire. And I think there's increased rates of economic inequality within the working age population from what we've seen in the past. And I think inequalities within Motherwell and within towns like it are very important for understanding the politics and social life of the town as well.
Right, we will head out of the Heritage Centre and indeed out of Motherwell altogether, because I'm going to go now and see the area that is being added on to this constituency further out of Glasgow, the new part that's coming into force because of the boundary changes. And my guide is going to be David Wallace-Lockhart, who is BBC Scotland's political correspondent. David, we're driving in towards the town of Carluke now. How much do you think this enlargement of the constituency, this boundary change, changes the politics of the seat?
It's not to say that people in this more rural part of Lanarkshire will have different day-to-day problems to the perhaps slightly more urban makeup of the seat originally, but it probably won't fundamentally change the politics of this seat. It's still going to be a Labour versus SNP fight at the next election. Realistically, I think the academics who have looked at it have concluded that it maybe becomes slightly more favourable to the SNP than under the existing boundaries with the changes in place.
Right, well, we're now in the centre of Carluke. How hard do you think it's going to be for the SNP to hang on to this seat?
It's certainly more of a challenge than it has been at previous elections. One problem for the SNP may well prove to be, for a lot of people who were pro-independence, is at this particular point in time they're not entirely convinced there's a route to independence in the near future. There may be at this election thinking about voting for Labour and getting the Conservatives out, as they see that as a short-term priority that could happen, as opposed to voting SNP and not being sure how that will ultimately deliver independence, at least in the near future. The SNP are sort of fighting back against that, saying, well, Labour are going to win anyway, and if you want to ensure that the interests of places like Carluke are represented, that Scottish voices are heard, the best way to do that is to have a Labour government which the SNP can have a big cohort of MPs at Westminster and try and sway in certain directions.
This is not one of Labour's top targets in Scotland, is it?
No, it's not. For example, look at 2017, when Scottish Labour had a bit of a resurgence, managed to return a handful of MPs back to Westminster. They won those handful of seats, but there were many seats that came very close. Just a bit more of a percentage swing in certain areas would have delivered far more seats. And I think the SNP hung on in Motherwell and Wishaw by about 300 votes, a much more comfortable retention of the seat in 2019. So it's one of those areas that a good night for Labour with or not a great night for Labour, and just a slight resurgence probably doesn't win them areas like this. But if they did manage to have, from their point of view, a great night in Scotland at the next election, then you'd expect this to be the sort of seat they did manage to retain, but that's to the side of having a better night rather than perhaps the side of having an average night.
David Wallace-Lockhart underlining really the challenge for Labour in winning back a significant part of what was once a heartland of Scottish wall of seats. And just to remind you where things stand in the current state of the parties in Scotland, 59 MPs at the moment. That is going to go down to 57, but the current picture includes 43 SNP MPs, 7 Conservatives and 2 Labour-held seats.
One reason the row between the SNP and Labour about what exactly to call for in the Middle East encounter does matter politically at the next election as well. We'll be talking more about those ceasefire calls with a veteran diplomat just after 8:30. It is now 29 minutes past 8 though, and here's what was
Again, Nick, Everton 1, Crystal Palace 1. That's last night's Premier League result, with Everton moving out of the bottom 3. And Palace's new manager, the Austrian Oliver Glasner, watching from the stands. He's replaced Roy Hodgson, who stepped down. He's now out of hospital and doing well, according to the club, after being taken ill last Thursday. One Premier League match tonight. Manchester City play Brentford at home. If City win, they'll go to within 1 point of leaders Liverpool. Well, now to the Netball Super League. 10 UK-based teams in a season that got underway last weekend with a match televised live by Sky. This coming weekend, in a new joint broadcasting agreement, the BBC will show Loughborough Lightning against Team Bath via the iPlayer and the BBC Sport website. I've been talking about the Super League's way ahead with its managing director, Claire Nelson.
This for us is about growing our game, growing visibility, and the BBC coming to the partnership is absolutely groundbreaking for us. This is a fantastic arrangement for us, and we're really excited to be working with the BBC.
Can you give us an idea of the value of the contracts and how you'll use the money?
I mean, I would like the value of the contracts to be much higher than they are, and that's what we're doing here with this partnership.
You're not saying the value is inadequate, though, are you?
Absolutely not. But what we need to do is grow the commercial value of our sport, and that comes through building our fan base. So this has always been part of our strategy, is about getting more eyeballs on our sport, and by being able to convert this huge participation base that we've got. I mean, netball is the #1 choice for women and girls above 16 in the country, and it's the 3rd biggest team sport behind men's and women's football and men's and women's cricket combined. So in order to convert that and start to drive more bums on seats, more eyeballs, then we need to get into more homes, we need a great product, and when we start to do that, that's when we will start to see those commercial values, whether it's in sponsorship or broadcast, start to rise.
Yes. Women's sport is booming, but I just wonder how concerned you are that football especially might take the lion's share of the attention and the money available to women's sport.
Yeah, and we recognise that at this moment in time, there's never been a better time to talk about women's sport. But, you know, we also have to recognise that football is dominating that market at this moment in time. So there's space for us all, though. This isn't about competition. It's about what we bring to the table. It's about finding our own path in this moment. And we need to build that regular fandom through it.
Well, it's interesting you talk about fandom, because you'll be aware, of course, that women's football is attracting crowds measured in tens of thousands. What kind of crowds would you expect to get into a top-level netball match?
Well, we're moving into bigger arenas. We just held our season opener at the Motorpoint Nottingham Arena on Saturday there, and we were a sellout. It was a 6,000 capacity crowd that we had, and we're seeing that through our internationals and our central events that there is growing demand, and we're really pushing those boundaries now into how we're filling our arenas. So that's why part of our professionalisation plans are really built around bigger venues, around arena venues, creating that sportainment feel. I don't know if you saw any of the content from the NBA at the weekend with LED floors and challenges. Sport is really pushing beyond what is happening on a court or on a pitch. New audiences, which are largely young and female, they're coming for additional content, and that's what we're carving out, and that's what indoor arenas really allow us to create at netball.
Jane Nelson, Managing Director of Netball Super League. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so to today's racing tips. Taunton 310, number 3 not at present. Market Raisin 325, also number 3 Party Vibes.
Thank you very much, Rob. And now to 9 o'clock when we'll have more from John Ronson.
In today's episode, how a young man with an idea for affordable accommodation and an Oxford man with a plan for bus lanes and a Danish woman writing a thought experiment about car rentals unwittingly became hate figures for conspiracy theorists.
Halfway through the meeting, several people stood up and started shouting, and they were talking about the Great Reset.
That's Things Fell Apart, Season 2, with me, John Ronson, in half an hour on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
And you can hear John Ronson's reflections on how conspiracy theories lead to culture wars on the latest edition of the Today podcast, which is, I guess, also available on BBC Sounds. Look at the weather now. Today will be cloudy and rather windy, with a band of rain sinking southeastward throughout the day. Heavy, blustery showers will develop in the northwest.
And just after 8:30, a summary of the news with Tom Sanders.
The United States has put forward a draft resolution at the UN Security Council calling for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable. Until now, Washington has avoided calling for any sort of ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas. BBC News has learnt that David Cameron's government knew the Post Office had dropped a secret investigation into its Horizon IT system that might have helped postmasters who were wrongly prosecuted to prove their innocence. The Labour chair of the Commons Business and Trade Committee, Liam Byrne, told us it appeared to be the first evidence that ministers had sight of what was going on at the Post Office. The defence and security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, says Russia is offering governments in Africa a regime survival package in exchange for access to strategically important natural resources. It suggests many of Moscow's activities in the continent are being carried out by a rebranded Wagner Group. The High Court in London is due to hear today what could be the final attempt by the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to avoid extradition to the United States on espionage charges. The hearing will consider whether Mr. Assange should be allowed a full appeal.
Tom, thank you. It's now 25 to 9. There can be no ceasefire until either total victory or Hamas returns all the hostages taken on October the 7th. That is Israel's position, and its principal ally, the United States, has vetoed any motion at the UN Security Council which uses that word. But now ceasefire does appear in a draft resolution which the White House is promoting, albeit as part of a diplomatic word sandwich. It calls for a temporary ceasefire as soon as is practicable. What does the wording tell us about what's really going on as the US tries to pressure Israel? I asked a veteran diplomat, US Ambassador Dennis Ross, Middle East envoy in both Republican and Democratic administrations.
Well, they're talking about a temporary ceasefire, so I'm not sure they're really changing fundamentally anything that they have been saying up until now. They've talked about pauses before. They've certainly favored a hostage deal that would provide an extended pause. All along when they've talked about pause, they viewed that as a way to basically cease fire for a while. I do think what you're seeing is an effort to head off a Security Council resolution that Algeria has been proposing, which is not about a temporary ceasefire, but a permanent one. I think the administration, is trying to compete with that and to show that it has an alternative draft, especially when it's not prepared to accept the Algerian one and would be prepared, I think, to veto it.
So the word ceasefire is simply that, a word, a tactic, not a shift in position.
That's the way I read it, yes. I think this is less a shift in position, although to be fair, I think it is a signal to Prime Minister Netanyahu that the administration's readiness to continue to go along with what he wants is beginning to wear a little bit thin, so he needs to be more responsive to the asks that they're making of him.
And yet, far from being responsive, what the Prime Minister is saying is that calls for him not to go into Rafah effectively amount to a call to surrender.
Here I see him playing to the right wing within his coalition, because I think he's concerned that they will bolt, and he doesn't want the government to fall. I also think that he understands that he has a problem, a twofold problem, if he goes in at this point without evacuation plans for those who are in Rafah. He has a problem with Egypt, which has said it will suspend the peace treaty. And he has a problem with us, who are his most important supporters. So I suspect that what you're saying in his case is a public posture that's not going to be matched necessarily by what they do in practice.
Do you think he's playing for time? The Israelis have talked of moving into Rafah by Ramadan, which gives a little bit of time for diplomacy to take place.
I do think he's playing for time. I think he's trying to balance a set of considerations. One is, I think he's also trying to affect Hamas, so that Hamas doesn't think that he can be pressured to stop. Israel has basically destroyed 18 of the 24 battalions that Hamas has. They have 4 in the Rafah area. But I actually think the bigger issue for Rafah is less the 4 battalions, which can be dealt with at some point. And it's much more the issue that Rafah and the Philadelphia corridor has been where most of the material coming into Gaza that Hamas has used to build the tunnels and to build its military-industrial base have come through this area either through Rafah or through tunnels that have been that are smuggling tunnels. So that has to be dealt with, and it's pretty hard to deal with that unless you come to some understanding with Egypt.
There is also the problem, of course, of terrible human suffering. The United Nations is reporting that 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 are now acutely malnourished. The United States cannot stand by and continue to allow that to happen, can they?
No, I don't think so, and I think there has to be more of an effort to make sure that gets addressed. How much of that is what the Israelis are letting in, how much of it is just the process of which the humanitarian assistance has to go through to get in, how much of it is the UN. I mean, there's a whole series of considerations, including the fact that there really hasn't been security for delivery of humanitarian assistance, and a lot of it is getting diverted by people who have guns.
There's been much talk in recent weeks of a grand bargain involving Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel. Isn't the fundamental problem with all that talk, which involves the release of the hostages, a pause in fighting for many days, that it involves some sort of agreement by Israel to head to a 2-state solution, which the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he's totally opposed to, and now wants the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, to vote against?
Look, I think until you actually are presenting something to him that actually is a deal and says, here's what's required of you, a lot of this is a kind of posturing on a lot of different ends. So is he positioning himself to resist the Palestinian state? I think politically he is, but I think we should all ask the question, if you actually have the terms of what Saudi normalization would be and what the price is, and that's then presented to him, then he has to make a choice. I'm not sure at this point exactly what that choice would be, because I think a lot depends upon the content of normalization, what the Saudis are prepared to do, and what they're asking of him to do on the Palestinians. Nobody, I think, is basically saying that you should have a Palestinian state if it's going to be dominated by Hamas, or it's going to be part of the axis of resistance. So when one talks about a Palestinian state, what is the process that one is talking about to get there, and what, if any, conditions are there that Palestinians must meet before they would have a state?
You wrote a book profiling 4 historic Israeli leaders. Be Strong and of Good Courage, it was called. Lots of sign of strength. Do you see much evidence of good courage?
Well, I think, look, the key to those 4 Israeli leaders who were quite different ideologically, We were talking about Ben Gurion and Begin and Rabin and Sharon. They were quite different ideologically, but they had one thing in common. The one thing in common was that they always put the country first. They put their politics second. And so Be Strong and of Good Courage was about having prime ministers who would put the country first and put their politics second. I think that's really necessary right now in Israel.
Necessary, but is there any sign of it?
I'm still hoping to see it.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It is now 18 minutes to 9. The Royal Society of Literature is not a happy place, it would appear. It has referred itself to the Charity Commission after what it says has been a sustained campaign of misinformation against it. Quite a few issues have been levelled against it by fellows, its members, including that a recent issue of its magazine was pulled because it contained criticism of Israel. There was a critical letter signed by writers including Ian McEwan and Andrew O'Hagan, which was organised by the literary critic and RSL fellow Jeremy Treglown.
The letter was written by a group of us. The reason we wrote it is that we haven't had a satisfactory answer from Molly Rosenberg, who is the director of the Society, about why this censorship of an article had occurred. We're quite sure that it occurred. The only way of clearing the air is for them to say, look, a mistake was made in censoring an article because it had favourable things to say about Palestine. This meeting tomorrow is really important from that point of view to reassure not only the trustees themselves, the members of council, but the rest of the fellowship that things are going to be run better in future.
Well, the poet Daljit Nagra is chair of the Royal Society of Literature and joins us. I should explain that the Society also has a president. That's more of an ambassadorial role, and that is held by Bernardine Evaristo. Daljit, welcome to the programme. First of all, what do you think is going on here?
Well, first of all, thank you for playing Jeremy Treglow, who's